She lived alone in the mountains, with only memories and silence to keep her company. One chilly autumn morning, she found a dirty old sack rustling in the forest. Inside, 4 tiny golden puppies, cold, starving, and left to die. She saved them without a second thought. But what no one knew is how those pups would one day save her, in a way that would bring the entire town to tears. The Blue Ridge Mountains stretched in solemn majesty, their slopes draped in the quiet decay of late autumn. Trees stood half naked, their last leaves trembling in the wind like forgotten prayers. The forest exhaled a damp chill that whispered through the hollows, laced with the earthy perfume of moss, pine needles, and wood smoke. Tucked into a clearing between 2 ridges stood a small wooden cabin, its roof sagging under time, but its chimney stubbornly breathing life into the air above. This was the home of Edeline Wren, 78 years old, and for the last 15 years, alone. She was a tall woman once, though age had softened her spine and slowed her gait. Her silver-white hair, thick and long, was usually bound in a loose braid that hung over one shoulder like a thread of moonlight. Her hands, though veined and gnarled, moved with purpose, the hands of someone who had chopped her own firewood, canned her own tomatoes, and turned the same doorknob 1,000 times. Her eyes, a cloudy storm gray, still held the gentle patience of a woman who had loved deeply and mourned quietly. Edeline had lived in this cabin with her husband Charles until the accident, the kind of senseless wilderness tragedy that left more silence than answers. He'd gone hunting before first snow and never returned. When they found him, it was too late. She buried him beneath the great oak just beyond the porch, the one that still stretched its ancient limbs like an old friend protecting the house. She often sat under it, whispering to the wind, telling Charles about her day, about the garden, about how lonely the nights had become. Despite the solitude, Edeline had not become bitter. She still spoke to the birds, still left a saucer of milk on the porch for passing strays, still believed that kindness was never wasted, even if no one saw it. Every Sunday, she wrote a letter to her daughter, Clara, who had moved to Chicago after college and hadn't returned in over 5 years. The letters, carefully written in a flowing script, were always gentle, never accusatory, and ended with the same line: "I hope you're warm. I hope you're happy. I still love you." She never stopped sending them, even though the last reply had come years ago. That night, before the world changed, Edeline dreamt of a dog. It came to her not as a creature she knew, but as a shadow, barking in the mist, racing through trees, calling to her in urgent, echoing cries. The forest in her dream was dense and strange. The barking was not aggressive, but pleading, as if the animal were trying to lead her somewhere. She woke just before dawn, heart hammering against her ribs, her breath fogging the air in the bedroom. Outside, the wind rustled dry leaves, but there were no barks, only the stillness of a waiting day. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. Something stirred in her, not fear, but the weight of an unspoken calling. So, she dressed, layered her woolen shawl over her faded sweater, pulled on thick socks and worn boots, and took the walking stick Charles had carved her from cedar on their 15th anniversary. The house seemed to watch her quietly as she stepped outside, the door creaking shut behind her. The forest path was overgrown in places but still familiar. She hadn't walked this far from the cabin in years. Her knees protested with every step, but something stronger than discomfort pulled her forward. It wasn't adventure she sought. It was understanding. A message hidden in a dream rarely comes without a reason. Golden light slanted through the trees as the morning rose higher. Edeline walked past the blackberry bushes where deer sometimes gathered, beyond the stone she and Charles used to sit on, into deeper woods where the air grew damper and colder. She followed the trail until it disappeared and then trusted her instincts, winding down toward the river that cut through the forest like a silver scar. The trees thinned and the sound of water grew louder, and then she heard it, a soft, stuttering whimper. She stopped. The sound came again, faint but unmistakably alive. Edeline turned her head, eyes scanning the shoreline. Just beyond the bend, caught between the roots of an old willow tree, something pale jutted out from the rocks, half hidden beneath a layer of fallen leaves. It was an old canvas sack, worn, stained, with fraying seams, the kind used to carry potatoes or firewood, and it moved. Another whimper. Edeline's breath caught. Her heart began to beat harder, not from fear, but something far older, an ancient protective ache that welled up from the center of her chest. She stepped slowly toward the sack, boots crunching damp gravel, the river murmuring beside her like a witness holding its tongue. And then the sound came again, clearer this time, a high, thin yelp. Something or someone was inside. Edeline crouched beside the sack, the river's cold breath brushing her cheeks as she reached out with careful fingers. The canvas was wet, heavy, and smelled of rot and mildew. Her hands trembled as she loosened the coarse knot at its mouth. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, 4 tiny, trembling bodies shifted inside. A chorus of soft whimpers rose into the chilly morning air, fragile and hoarse like the last gasps of a dying fire. Her breath hitched. They were puppies, golden retriever pups, no more than 4 weeks old, barely larger than loaves of bread. Their fur was matted with mud, their bellies hollow from hunger. One lay still, its ribs faintly rising and falling. Another tried to lift its head, a single eye half open, clouded with fatigue. Their ears twitched as she whispered gently, "It's all right, little ones. I've got you now." She wrapped them in her wool shawl, pressing them close to her chest. Their warmth was faint, but real. She cradled the bundle as though it contained embers she couldn't let go out. The climb back to the cabin was slow. The path seemed longer than before, her legs weaker, her arms heavier, but never once did she shift the pups away from her body. The smallest of them whimpered every few minutes, a soft, aching sound that pushed her forward more effectively than any sense of duty. By the time she reached her porch, the sky had grown pale with noon light, and her back throbbed from the strain. Inside, she lit the fireplace with hands she hadn't realized were numb, then laid the puppies in a basket lined with rags and blankets she kept for mending. She moved with urgent tenderness, warming milk on the stove, filling an old syringe dropper, and coaxing each mouth open in turn. 2 fed greedily, 1 required gentle prodding, and the smallest, its eyes barely open, refused at first, until Edeline pressed it to her chest for warmth, whispering lullabies she hadn't sung since Clara was an infant. When they were fed, she cleaned them with warm cloths, murmuring soothing nonsense and names as they blinked sleepily up at her. She named the quiet one Ash, for his ashy-colored paws and silent demeanor. The bolder pup who kept trying to escape the basket became Maple, golden and wild. The most timid, always curling beneath the others, was Fern. And the one with a small tear on its hind leg, who growled softly even in his tiny size, she called Bramble. Each name felt like a promise, a tether tying them to the earth, to safety. The afternoon passed in a haze of warmth and careful motion. Edeline barely noticed the passage of time. Her cabin, so often steeped in silence, now hummed with the soft sounds of life, snuffling noses, sleepy sighs, the occasional sharp yip when Maple tumbled too far from the group. But that night, as she was checking Bramble's leg again, she noticed the wound wasn't just a scrape from the rocks or a thorn. It looked jagged, circular, like a bite. Her breath caught. It wasn't large. Whatever had bitten the pup had been small, maybe another animal. But the angle and depth were strange, deliberate. A chill settled over her. Who would leave 4 puppies in a sack beside a river? Not a careless owner. This was intentional. Abandonment was one thing. But this bordered on cruelty. Sleep didn't come easily that night. She sat by the fire long after the pups had curled into each other, their bellies full and their breathing steady. She watched the flames, her thoughts heavy. The image of the bite haunted her. By morning, the wound had grown red around the edges. Bramble whimpered when she touched it. Infection. She had to get him help. And for that, she had to go somewhere she hadn't dared in years, the town below. It was a 20-mile drive to Brook Hollow, the nearest town with a vet. Edeline hadn't driven that far since before Charles died. Her truck, a faded blue 1997 Chevy, had been lovingly maintained, but rarely moved beyond the mountain trail. That morning, she packed Bramble into a crate lined with blankets, left a note taped to the front door in case someone came by, though no one ever did, and began the slow descent. The road was winding, narrow, and half-eaten by time. Frost still clung to the shaded turns, and the brakes moaned in protest on every curve. But Edeline drove with a steady grip, her eyes flicking from the road to the crate beside her, where Bramble lay breathing shallowly. She arrived in Brook Hollow just before noon. The town hadn't changed much. Same red brick shops, same faded awnings, same old diner with its sign hanging crooked. She drove straight to the vet clinic, a small white building with a green cross painted above the door. The parking lot was empty except for a Forest Service vehicle, mud-spattered, with a tan and green decal on the side. As she stepped out of the truck, holding Bramble close in a towel, the clinic door opened and a young man stepped out. He was tall, lean, early 30s at most, with sun-browned skin and shaggy chestnut hair tucked beneath a forest ranger cap. His eyes were an unusual color, hazel with specks of green and sharp with curiosity. He wore the standard ranger uniform, scuffed boots, and a radio clipped to his belt. He paused when he saw her, then offered a warm, respectful nod. "Ma'am," he said. "Need help?" Edeline adjusted the bundle in her arms. "I found a pup. He's hurt. I think it might be infected." The man stepped closer, his eyes flicking to the puppy. "Golden retriever?" He squinted. "Wait, 4 weeks old? I just heard something about... Well, let's get him inside first." Inside the clinic, the vet, an older woman named Dr. Whitby, short, practical, with square glasses and a no-nonsense tone, immediately took Bramble and began cleaning the wound. "It's a bite," she muttered. "Likely another dog. Infection setting in, but we caught it early." Edeline stood quietly, watching, until the ranger spoke again. "I'm Eli Harper," he said, extending a hand. "Forest Patrol. I heard from a hiker last week that there were strange sounds near the southern river bend, whimpers. I was going to check it today." "I found him there," Edeline said, "and 3 more, in a sack." Eli's jaw tensed. "That's not natural. Someone's been up there, and not for anything good." She nodded. There was something in the way Eli looked at the puppy, the concern in his brow, that made her trust him instinctively. They talked briefly while Bramble was tended to. Eli asked questions. What day, what time, what the sack looked like. His voice was calm, but edged with tension, like a wire stretched too tight. He took notes, promised to check the area, and gave her his card. "Call me if anything strange happens," he said. "Even if it's nothing. Better safe than sorry." As Edeline carried Bramble back to the truck, now resting, stitched and wrapped, she glanced at the ranger again. Young, yes, but not green. There was something in his eyes that reminded her of Charles in his younger days, watchful, steady, full of quiet questions. Back on the mountain that evening, Edeline fed the other pups, checked their bellies, kissed their noses. Bramble was sleepy, but better. The fire crackled, the room felt full again. But as she sat on her rocking chair, the card Eli gave her tucked into the pocket of her sweater, she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had changed. Someone had been there, someone who meant harm. And for the first time in years, the silence of the mountain didn't feel like peace. It felt like waiting. The first real snow came early that year. By late November, the Blue Ridge Mountains had dressed themselves in white, softening the jagged paths and quieting even the bird song. Edeline Wren's cabin, now dotted with footprints of 4 small golden lives, pulsed with warmth and a new kind of rhythm, no longer dictated by silence, but by feeding schedules, little howls, and sleepy sighs curled up beside the hearth. In the early hours, Edeline would wake before the sun, sometimes not from habit but from instinct, the quiet whimper of Fern, who disliked the dark, or the muffled rustling of Maple, who refused to stay in the blanket nest. She moved through her days with a sense of purpose she hadn't known in years, though her joints ached and her hands stiffened more often now in the cold. The puppies were growing quickly. Ash remained her shadow, watching her every move with thoughtful eyes. Maple was the mischief maker, bounding clumsily into baskets and overturning her neatly stacked knitting yarn. Fern liked to hide beneath the cupboard and peek out, wide-eyed and uncertain. And Bramble had healed well. His leg, once red and swollen, now carried him with stubborn pride. He was the first to bark, the last to sleep, and had taken to guarding the porch as if he owned it. Edeline found herself talking more, out loud, not just in her thoughts. She told stories as she fed them, her voice soft, like water running over stones. The pups would watch her, heads tilted, as if they understood the weight behind her words. Charles was never patient, she'd chuckle, pouring goat's milk into 4 tiny bowls. He once tried to build a chicken coop without reading the instructions. We ended up with something that looked like a haunted outhouse and 3 very angry hens. She didn't plan to tell the stories, they came on their own. The memories, long buried beneath solitude and routine, began to rise like spring water after a thaw. She spoke of the early years, how she met Charles at a community dance in Asheville, how he'd brought her mountain daisies instead of roses, how they built the cabin plank by plank with their bare hands. And she spoke of the later years too, quiet winters, whispered promises, and the day he didn't come back. The dogs didn't flinch when she cried. Ash would climb into her lap. Fern would nuzzle her knee. It was enough. One afternoon, as she worked in the garden behind the cabin, loosening the frozen soil around her dormant herb beds, Edeline felt a sudden sharp pain in her hip. It was so swift, so unexpected, that her legs gave out from under her. She fell sideways into the dirt, gasping as her shoulder struck the corner of a wooden crate. The pain was blinding for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to rise but couldn't. Snow was beginning to fall again. The sky above spun slightly, and her hands trembled as she tried to shift her weight. "Not now," she whispered. "Please, not like this." From somewhere near the porch, a bark split the air. It was sharp, urgent. Maple. The little pup stood at the edge of the steps, eyes locked on her, tail stiff. Then, without hesitation, he turned and darted into the trees. Edeline, groaning, called weakly after him, "No, come back!" But Maple didn't pause. The world blurred. The cold crept under her coat. And then, a strange peace settled over her, as if the mountain itself was folding her gently into its arms. She closed her eyes and thought of Charles. It was nearly 30 minutes later when she heard branches crackling and boots against frost. A voice, low, steady, familiar. "Mrs. Wren!" And then he was there. Eli Harper, the young forest ranger, emerged through the tree line, his coat dusted with snow, his green-flecked eyes wide with concern. He dropped to his knees beside her without a word, checked her breathing, then eased her upright with strong, practiced hands. "Maple came right to my patrol truck," he said, breathless, ran out of the woods barking his head off like the forest was on fire. "I followed him straight here." Edeline laughed, despite the pain. It came out ragged and disbelieving. "That pup, I thought he'd gone to chase squirrels." Eli smiled softly as he helped her into the house. "I think he knew exactly what he was doing." Inside, he stoked the fire, warmed a towel, and brought her tea while she rested on the couch. His movements were quiet, respectful, never overbearing. When she thanked him, he simply shrugged. "Forrest knows how to raise the right dogs," he said. That evening, while the wind howled and the snow thickened outside, Eli stayed a while longer. They sat together, she in her rocker, he on the hearthstone, his hands loosely clasped, the pups, now calm, curled in their usual heap beside the fire. Eli looked around the cabin, at the patchwork curtains, the bookshelves, the mason jars filled with dried herbs and saved buttons. "You've built a world up here," he said. Edeline nodded. "It kept me going. After Charles, after Clara stopped writing." He tilted his head. "Clara? My daughter." Her voice cracked on the word. "We had a falling out. Nothing dramatic, just one of those cracks that widens over time. She lives in Chicago, or did." Eli didn't press. He simply said, "Maybe she'll write again." "I still send letters," Edeline admitted, "every Sunday. I don't know if she reads them." There was silence between them, but not an uncomfortable one, the kind of quiet that exists only when someone is truly listening. Before leaving, Eli offered to come by again the next week. "I've got a spare tarp," he said. "Your roof's got a soft spot. I'll patch it up before it becomes a real problem." Edeline nodded. That would be kind, and he did. Over the next several days, Eli returned with tools, canned food, and a half-laughing excuse about getting to know the mountain better. Sometimes he stayed for tea. Sometimes he left dog biscuits on the porch. The pups came to know him, barking joyfully at his scent. Even Fern, the shyest of the four, would nudge his boot with her nose. One morning, Edeline found a small package on her doorstep. Inside was a new pen, wrapped in brown paper, and a note, "In case you feel like writing something new." Her hands trembled as she held it. For the first time in many years, Edeline Wren didn't feel like the last leaf on a withered branch. She felt, quietly, stubbornly, like spring might come again. The storm came down the mountain like a slow-moving beast, its breath thick with mist and thunder. By nightfall, the wind clawed at the windows of Edeline's cabin, and the trees bent and whispered warnings only old souls could understand. The fire inside crackled steadily, casting flickering light across the wooden floor where 4 golden pups huddled together, their eyes wide and ears twitching with each rumble of thunder. Edeline sat in her rocking chair, a quilt draped over her legs and a cup of chamomile tea cooling in her hands. The dogs had sensed the change in the weather before she had. Bramble paced near the door earlier that afternoon, his stance protective. Maple barked at the sky. Now, though, they were silent, watching the shadows on the walls as if the storm might seep through the cracks. It was near midnight when she drifted off, her head nodding gently as rain lashed the roof. But she didn't stay asleep for long. Ash, always the calmest, rarely barked. But tonight, he let out a single sharp woof that cut through the wind like an arrow, then another. Then he was nudging her arm, pawing at her shawl with surprising insistence. She stirred, blinking. "What is it, love?" Ash trotted toward the front door, then turned and looked back at her. Something wasn't right. Edeline stood slowly, joints protesting, and shuffled toward the entrance. The wind pushed hard against the door when she opened it, and cold rain slapped her face. The lantern on the porch swung wildly, casting wild arcs of light. And there, in the mist, stood a figure, soaked, shivering. One hand pressed to her side, the other reaching out toward the light. A woman. Younger than Edeline, but not young. Perhaps in her late 30s, her features barely visible beneath a tangled curtain of wet, dark blonde hair. She was tall, narrow-shouldered, with a posture half collapsed from exhaustion. Her clothes, jeans, a rain-soaked jacket, hiking boots caked in mud, clung to her like second skin. And even before she stepped fully into the light, even before she opened her lips, Edeline knew. "Clara," she whispered. The woman's lips trembled. "Mama," she breathed. I didn't know if you were still here. I crashed. My car, somewhere past the bend. Then I heard barking. I followed them." Edeline didn't wait. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her daughter, pulling her in close. Clara clung to her like a branch in a flood. Her body shook not just from the cold, but from something deeper, the kind of shaking that comes from breaking too long and too quietly. Inside, the cabin welcomed her like a memory made real. The pups swarmed her feet, tails wagging, sniffing with curiosity. Ash remained at her side, as if proud of the role he had played. Edeline helped Clara out of her wet coat, sat her near the fire, wrapped her in a dry blanket, and placed a mug of warm tea in her hands without a word. Clara looked around the cabin, at the mismatched curtains, the hand-carved shelves, the faded photograph of Charles still sitting above the mantel. "It's all the same," she said softly. "Even smells the same, smoke and pine and rosemary." Edeline sat across from her. The years between them stretched taut, an invisible thread that trembled with every breath. But Edeline didn't ask why it had taken so long. She only said, "You're home." Clara stared into the flames for a while, then she spoke. "I left because I didn't want to become like you," she said. Her voice wasn't cruel. It was tired, honest. "So afraid of losing something that I never let anything close. After Dad died, I couldn't handle your silence, the way you walked through the house like a ghost." Edeline nodded slowly. "And I was afraid if I held you too tightly, you'd break." "I know," Clara said, "and I broke anyway." There was a long pause. Outside, the storm softened into a steady drizzle. The dogs settled near Clara's feet, their presence warm and grounding. "I wasn't going to come back," Clara admitted, "but then I got sick." Edeline's gaze sharpened. "What do you mean?" Clara set down the tea. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled the sleeve of her sweater higher, revealing a hospital bracelet she hadn't removed. "Stage 4, she said quietly. "Lung, and no, I never smoked. Life's funny like that." Edeline didn't speak. "I have a few months, maybe. I didn't come to be forgiven, Mama. I wanted to see you again. One last time." Edeline crossed the room in silence and knelt before her daughter. Her hands, worn from years of work and sorrow, cupped Clara's face gently. "You came back," she whispered. "That's all I ever needed." They sat like that for a long while, Two women wrapped in the warmth of forgiveness and the cold truth of time. The pups curled close around them, sensing something sacred had happened, something that couldn't be named. Eventually, Edeline helped Clara to the small guest bed in the loft, unused for years, but still made with care. She brought up an extra quilt, the thickest one she owned, and a hot water bottle wrapped in wool. Before Clara drifted off to sleep, she looked at her mother and smiled weakly. "Those puppies. They saved me. I would have died out there if I hadn't heard them. I followed their barking like it was music." Edeline brushed damp hair from her daughter's brow. "Then they were meant to find you." Downstairs, Ash lay beside the front door, ever watchful. Maple was stretched belly up near the hearth. Bramble snored softly, and Fern curled into Edeline's slipper like it was a nest. As the storm passed and moonlight began to break through the mist, Edeline stood at the window, watching the forest breathe again. Her daughter was asleep. Her home was full. And though sorrow still waited in the shadows, for the first time in many years, Edeline Wren felt something unexpected blooming in her chest. Hope. The storm was long gone now, leaving behind clean air, soaked soil, and a quiet more profound than usual. Mornings on the mountain became slow rituals of light and warmth, sunbeams cutting through misty pines, coffee simmering on the stove, and the soft patter of golden paws across wooden floors. For the first time in many years, the cabin on Blue Ridge Mountain did not feel like a shelter for one woman's grief. It felt like a home. Clara settled into the rhythm of mountain life more quickly than either she or her mother had expected. Her body, still weakened from treatment, moved with deliberate slowness, but she rarely complained. She wore long knit sweaters and soft hats to shield her from the morning chill. Her once sleek city posture now relaxed into something gentler. Her smile came easier. She laughed more, even when it brought on a cough. There were days her color improved, days her strength returned in bursts, carrying a basket of chopped wood, helping Edeline stir the soup, brushing knots from Maple's ever-tangled fur. The puppies had taken to her with fierce loyalty. Bramble, usually the aloof sentinel, slept beneath her bed. Ash was never far from her side, especially when she read aloud from the old books Edeline had tucked away over the years. Fern would paw at her hand gently during coughing fits, and Maple, still a reckless sprite, often dropped leaves into her lap, as if presenting little forest treasures. For Edeline, the presence of her daughter brought about a quiet bloom. She moved with renewed steadiness, her face less drawn, her eyes bright with the colors of memory and forgiveness. They spent long afternoons knitting together on the porch, speaking of nothing and everything. Clara told stories about Chicago, some true, some exaggerated for laughter. She admitted she'd once considered moving to California, taking a job at a vineyard. Edeline spoke of Charles, of their early years on the mountain, of Clara's first words spoken beside the old oak tree in the front yard. One evening, as the dogs played beneath the fading sun, Edeline and Clara sat watching the light change on the hills. "You named them after plants," Clara said, smiling as Bramble tackled Maple in a flurry of fur and joy. "I named them after things that survive the cold," Edeline replied, "the kinds of things that come back in spring." That night, Edeline found a small sketch tucked into one of her old journals, drawn in Clara's hand. It was of the 4 dogs curled around the base of the oak tree, their eyes closed, their bodies peaceful. Beneath it, Clara had written, "They forgave us first." Outside their bubble of peace, the world had not stopped. Eli Harper visited more often, now not just as a ranger, but as something closer to kin. He brought bags of dog food, a toolkit to fix the porch railing, and once a bouquet of wildflowers that he left quietly in a jar on the windowsill. He was careful not to intrude, always asking permission, always offering help instead of assuming it. His presence brought a steady, grounding energy. Eli was in his early 30s, lean and long-limbed, with a quiet strength and the kind of face that held both curiosity and care. His forest ranger uniform often bore signs of wear, mud on the knees, a small tear near the collar, but he wore it with the ease of someone who knew the woods better than most people know themselves. He spoke rarely of his past, but once, during a lunch of soup and cornbread, he mentioned that he had been raised by his grandfather after losing his parents in a house fire when he was 8. Since then, he'd lived with a deep sense of debt to the land, and a mistrust of anything that smelled like cruelty. It was during one of his patrols that Eli stumbled across something that set his instincts ablaze. About 5 miles south of Edeline's cabin, near an abandoned hunting trail, he found a cluster of metal cages, half buried in brush, rusted, but not yet consumed by time. One still held a length of broken chain. Nearby, he discovered fresh boot prints and what looked like discarded kibble packaging. His stomach turned. He returned the next day with a colleague, Ranger Dana Liu, a compact woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a dry wit. Together they found more evidence: tire tracks leading to a secluded area, plastic bowls, and even a leather collar marked with crude numbers instead of a name. "I think we found your answer," Eli told Edeline 2 days later. He stood on her porch, cap in hand, voice low. "I don't think those pups ended up in that sack by accident. I think they were rejects." "Rejects?" Clara echoed from the rocking chair, a blanket around her knees. Eli nodded grimly. "There's a network. Backyard breeders, illegal stuff. They breed for money, for looks. If a pup's too sick, weak, or doesn't look perfect, they dispose of them. Usually worse. Sometimes they just dump them." Edeline's hands clenched around the teacup. The dogs, as if sensing the tension, drew closer. "I filed a report with the regional office," Eli continued. "We'll need more before we can press charges, but I'll keep looking." Clara watched him with a furrowed brow. How can people do that to something so defenseless? Eli looked at the pups curled around Clara's feet. "Because some people forget that life means something. These little ones remind me otherwise." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She rose quietly, wrapped herself in a shawl, and stepped out onto the porch. The stars were impossibly bright above the ridge, the kind of clarity only found in deep country. She looked out at the dark silhouettes of the trees and listened, to crickets, to distant owls, to the heartbeat of the mountain. Ash came beside her and leaned gently against her leg. "I didn't deserve them," she said softly, "or her, but they love us anyway." Behind her, a light flicked on in the kitchen. Edeline's shadow moved slowly across the window, and in that moment, Clara realized that what had broken between them wasn't trust, it was time. And now, by some miracle of bark and fur and forgiveness, they were beginning to stitch it back together. The winter deepened, and with it came a tension that Edeline couldn't quite explain. The trees stood bare now, their branches like black veins clawing at a silver sky. Snow dusted the ground in soft layers, muffling footsteps and muting the once joyful sounds of birds and wind. The cabin, once full of warmth and laughter, now hummed with an undercurrent of something unsaid, something waiting. Eli had been gone longer than usual. At first, it was just an extra day. Then 2. He'd told them he was following up on a lead, something about the direction the tire tracks had taken, toward a stretch of land deeper than most dared to patrol alone. A place called Wolf Hollow, a dense thicket of pine and sharp rock, once used for illegal hunting camps and now mostly abandoned. He promised to keep radio contact. But on the 3rd day, the calls stopped. That morning, Edeline stood by the fire, her fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Clara sat beside the window, her thin frame wrapped in layers of wool, her eyes fixed on the forest beyond the glass. The dogs sensed the unease. Ash refused to nap. Maple barked at every breeze. Fern wouldn't leave Clara's lap. But Bramble was different. He stood at the front door, ears alert, tail still. He hadn't moved from that spot for an hour. Just watched the woods, as if waiting for a sound only he could hear. "He knows something," Clara said, gently petting Fern's head. "He's been pacing since last night." Edeline looked down at Bramble, whose golden coat shimmered with health now, muscles firm beneath thick fur, eyes sharp and intelligent. "I don't like this," she murmured. "If something happened to Eli—" "He'll come back," Clara said softly, though the tremble in her voice betrayed the doubt. But Bramble wouldn't wait. Just before noon, he let out a low growl, then a single bark. He nudged the door with his nose, turned to Edeline, and barked again. Urgent. Sharp. "He wants us to follow," Edeline whispered. Clara stood slowly. "You can't go out there alone, Mama. Not in this cold. Let me—" Edeline shook her head. "You're not strong enough yet." "Then we wait." But Bramble had already turned toward the trees, paws breaking through the snow, his path deliberate. Edeline watched him disappear into the white, heart pounding. In the forest beyond, Eli Harper lay curled beneath the twisted roots of a fallen pine. His leg was wrapped in a makeshift bandage, soaked red. His radio, now useless, had cracked when he slipped during the chase. The pain radiated from his thigh in hot pulses, and he'd been drifting in and out of consciousness since nightfall. It had all happened so fast. The man he'd been tracking, a wiry, sun-leathered figure named Reed Mallory, known in backwoods rumor as Dog Man, had been smart, if careless. A breeder-turned-smuggler, Mallory had once operated a string of illegal kennels across 3 counties, pulling in profits by selling sickly pups to online buyers who never asked questions. When the heat came down, he vanished into the forest with whatever stock he could carry, and left the rest to die. Eli had followed the trail for days. He'd found a burned-out van, several traps, and the smell of blood in the snow when he finally saw Mallory, grizzled, hollow-eyed, with a limp and a rusted shotgun slung over his shoulder. The chase began. Eli radioed in coordinates, but the signal cut. He chased Mallory up a ridge slick with ice. A loose stone, a wrong step, and Eli went tumbling through snow and rock. His legs snapped under him like dry pine. Now he lay there, lips cracked, eyes fluttering. Mallory was gone. The cold bit deeper with every hour. But then, through the trees, footsteps. Not heavy boots, paws, bramble. He appeared from the mist like a flame in the fog, nose low to the ground, eyes scanning, ears up. When he reached Eli, he paused only for a second, then began licking his face, whining softly. Eli stirred, groaned, tried to speak. "You clever boy," he rasped. Bramble darted forward, then back, trying to guide him. But Eli couldn't stand. Bramble barked once, then did something astonishing. He pressed his nose against Eli's chest, nudging him until Eli's good arm wrapped around the dog's neck. Inch by inch, Bramble helped him slide forward, dragging his weight with small, determined steps. Not far, just enough to shift position. Eli coughed, his breath misting in front of him. And then Bramble turned, sniffing the air, and he ran. But not away from the ridge. He was following a scent, the scent of memory. Bramble ran until he reached a trailhead choked with vines, one long buried by snow and time. It led toward an overgrown path, barely visible, curving along the ridge, a forgotten trail Charles Wren had once walked, the one he'd vanished on 15 years earlier. The trail opened into a crevice between stone outcroppings, where wind no longer reached and snow barely touched. It curved downward into a narrow canyon, protected by natural walls, leading, unseen by most, back toward the lower edge of the mountain, back toward home. And Bramble remembered it, because Edeline had taken them walking there, weeks ago, just once, for a quiet afternoon stroll, and the scent still lingered. Pine, smoke, rosemary, and something softer. Belonging. He reached the edge of the canyon, barked 3 times, then turned back toward Eli and ran again. It took him 20 minutes, but when he returned, Eli stirred. He followed again, slowly, painfully, step by step. When Eli finally stumbled through the mouth of the canyon and collapsed onto the snow-packed path near Edeline's garden gate, it was dusk. Bramble howled, a long, triumphant sound that echoed across the ridge. Edeline came running, coat flung over her shoulders. Clara followed behind, breathless, her eyes wide. Eli lay there, bruised and half frozen, but smiling. "You've got a hell of a dog," he murmured. Edeline knelt, tears already streaming. "We have 4, she said, but this one just became a legend." Clara touched his hand gently. "You're safe now. Come inside." And as they carried Eli back to the fire, Bramble sat tall in the doorway, chest puffed, tail wagging. Later that night, after Clara helped change Eli's bandage and Edeline prepared a broth, the ranger spoke again, his voice hoarse. "That trail, the one Bramble led me through. I think it's the old hunting path, the one your husband used to talk about." Edeline froze. Charles? She hadn't walked it since the day they found his rifle, just beyond the ridge. She thought the trail was sealed by rockfall, lost to time. But now, found again, by a dog with a name like Thorn and a heart like Flame. By the time the first golden leaves of autumn began to fall across the ridge, Reed Mallory had been found, arrested, and brought down the mountain in handcuffs. He hadn't gone quietly. He'd been hiding deep in Wolf Hollow, surviving on jerky and bitterness. but a team led by Eli tracked him down. Mallory's camp, once a pit of neglect and cruelty, was dismantled within days. The surviving dogs were rescued, treated, and rehomed through shelters that had long waited for justice. His name, once a whisper in the woods, would be remembered now for what it truly was, a shadow banished by the light. Eli Harper, though hailed for his role in bringing the man to justice, refused any ceremony. He accepted a commendation from the Forestry Service with quiet nods, and then returned to the cabin not for applause, but for something more lasting: belonging. He didn't go back to town. Instead, with a modest grant and some help from locals who admired his work, Eli began building a small house just a few hundred yards from Adeline's property. It was simple: pine frame, tin roof, wide porch. But it looked out over the same valley Charles had once called his favorite view. Eli's hands, though still scarred from the chase and the fall, moved with patience and skill. Bramble often lay near his boots as he worked, tail thumping in the snow, eyes alert. When Eli sawed planks or hammered nails, Ash would sit on the hill and watch, solemn as a sentinel. The dogs knew he wasn't just visiting anymore. Inside Adeline's cabin, life took on a slower, sweeter pace. Clara's illness had returned more sharply as summer faded. Her strength waned quietly, like a candle drawing toward its final breath. But the days they spent together were rich with softness. She wrote poetry again, pages of it, folded and left in books for her mother to find later. She taught Adeline how to use the old camera they'd once shared, and together they filled a box with photographs. The dogs in motion, the sun behind the trees, Eli wiping sweat from his brow beside a half-built window frame. And when she felt well enough, Clara read aloud, sometimes from Adeline's old journals, sometimes from her own. Her voice, though raspier now, held warmth. She spoke of things she'd never said, about fear, about leaving, about the ache of time lost and the wonder of finding her way home again. When the leaves turned to amber and the nights sharpened, Clara asked Adeline to sit beside her under the oak tree, just once more. They sat on a bench Charles had carved decades ago, a blanket wrapped around their legs, tea steaming in their hands. The 4 dogs played in the yard below, their golden coats catching the last light like fallen stars. "You know," Clara said softly, "when I first left, I thought I'd never come back because I wasn't strong enough. But it turns out, coming back took more courage." Adeline didn't speak. She only took her daughter's hand and held it in her own. The veins on both hands were pronounced now, one aged by time, the other by illness. But there was no difference in their grip. Weeks later, on a clear autumn morning, Clara passed away in her sleep, her head resting on her mother's shoulder. It was quiet, like the fall of the last leaf on the tree that had watched over them all these years. She left behind a letter, sealed in an envelope addressed simply, "To Mama." Inside, in her looping script, Clara wrote, "Don't stop living when I'm gone. Live louder. Love those dogs the way they love you. Let Eli keep fixing things. And write it all down. Somebody out there needs to know it's never too late to come home." By December, the cabin was filled with motion again. Maple had grown into a tall, lanky whirlwind of energy, always knocking over boots or stealing gloves from the porch. Fern remained shy, but had become the most affectionate of the 4, often placing her head gently on Adeline's lap and sighing like an old soul. Ash was still the thinker, quiet and dignified, always watching, always near. And Bramble, the brave, wild-hearted Bramble, had begun training at the local health clinic with Eli's help. The clinic's lead nurse, Miranda Jacobs, a short, freckled woman in her 50s with a habit of humming lullabies, had noticed Bramble's calm demeanor with nervous patients. Now, twice a week, Adeline rode with Eli into town so Bramble could visit the children's ward and the hospice wing. He brought comfort in silence, the way only animals truly can. Miranda once told Adeline, "That dog has more empathy in his eyes than most people I know." Adeline smiled because she knew it was true. The cabin had changed too. Clara's room upstairs had become a writing nook. Adeline had dusted off her old typewriter, and each morning, while the dogs snoozed by the fire and snow fell like powdered sugar outside the window, she typed. At first, it was just notes, then letters, then stories. She wrote about Charles, about Clara, about the riverbank and the canvas sack, about 4 tiny lives that turned winter into spring again. One of those stories found its way to a small-town journalist named Kelsey Moran, a fresh-faced reporter in her 20s who ran a column called Heartland Echoes. Kelsey was petite, with wide brown eyes and a voice that warmed quickly with excitement. She visited the cabin one January morning, took notes in a leather-bound journal, and cried 3 times during the interview. The piece she wrote, titled "The Winter They Came," went viral across the state. Letters began to arrive, dozens, then hundreds, from widows in Vermont, from veterans in Arkansas, from a woman in Texas who said she'd been planning to end her life until she read about Edeline and her pups. The mailbox at the foot of the ridge overflowed. Eli built a new one, then a bigger one. One snowy morning, Edeline sat by the fire with a steaming mug of cocoa, wrapped in a flannel robe. The dogs surrounded her in a halo of fur and breath and warmth. Outside the window, Eli hammered the final shingle onto the roof of his tiny house, smiling at her through the frost-speckled glass. She looked down at the page in her lap. If you are reading this, you may feel alone. I once did too. But love has a way of arriving even when we believe it won't. Sometimes it walks on 2 legs, sometimes 4. Sometimes it takes the long way home, through grief and storm and silence. But when it comes, let it in. And when it stays, never stop telling the story. She signed the page, Edeline Wren. And outside, snow kept falling. But in the cabin on the mountain, there was no longer any winter in her heart. Only warmth, only love, only the sound of 4 golden dogs breathing softly around her, their bodies rising and falling in perfect rhythm, as if the forest itself had found a heartbeat again. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with trumpet sounds or shining lights. Sometimes, they come in the quiet padding of 4 little paws, in the form of a forgotten trail rediscovered, or in the last hug between a mother and daughter, once torn apart by time. This story reminds us, God doesn't always send angels with wings. Sometimes, He sends them covered in fur, with eyes full of understanding and hearts full of unconditional love. Perhaps you've lost someone. Perhaps you're sitting alone, wondering if it's too late to begin again. But as Edeline discovered, it is never too late for love, for healing, or for hope. Even the coldest winter can become the beginning of someone else's spring. So today, if you're watching this with tears in your eyes or a warm heart, take a deep breath and remember, God sees you. He hears you. He still writes stories like this, every single day. A small prayer for you watching. May God bless you with companionship when you feel lonely, with comfort when your heart is heavy, and with small, unexpected miracles, like Edeline's dogs, that remind you, you are never truly alone. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell us, have you ever experienced a small miracle in your life? Don't forget to subscribe for more true, heartwarming stories that renew faith, restore hope, and remind us of the beauty in everyday love. And may the Lord bless you and keep you as you carry this story with you into your own. Have you ever been to the Grand Canyon? It's breathtaking. But what happened there one quiet morning will leave you in tears. They threw a 1-month-old puppy into the abyss like garbage. But by pure chance, a man who came every day just to watch the view saw it happen. And what he did next will restore your faith in humanity. Comment below if you've ever felt powerless and then found the strength to do something right. Elliot March had long since forgotten how to believe in miracles. At 48, with salt and pepper hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck and eyes that had once been likened to storm glass, he lived quietly in a modest, 1-story house on the edge of Flagstaff. A writer once revered for his intimate explorations of the human condition, Elliot had tasted literary fame in his 30s. His first 2 novels had been hailed as raw and transformative, but words had betrayed him in recent years. Since the divorce, since his editor stopped calling, since the silence in his home grew so thick it clung to his skin like damp wool, he had not written a sentence worth keeping. He had, however, taken to walking. Long, wordless walks. Every Saturday morning, he drove the hour-long stretch to the Grand Canyon, not for photographs or hiking records, but to sit quietly on the rim and watch the shadows move along the rocks like ancient spirits. The canyon was his cathedral. Its silence was different from the one in his home. It was vast, earned, eternal. That morning the air was crisp, the sun climbing steadily behind him as he wandered off trail along a lesser-known ridge. He wore his usual hiking boots, faded jeans, and a brown canvas jacket that once belonged to his father. The wind teased at the ends of his scarf as he reached a clearing. That was when he saw them. Two figures, teenagers perhaps, stood near the edge. Their laughter, sharp and mean, floated back to him on the breeze. They were dressed in black hoodies, both wearing masks. One a snarling wolf, the other a cartoonish baby face. It might have seemed like a joke from a distance. Elliot slowed, watching from behind a bush of desert sage, half curious, half cautious. Then one of them held something squirming, a small bundle, wriggling, making a muffled noise that didn't sound quite human. Before Elliot could process it, the boy in the wolf mask let out a mocking bark. Then, with sudden violence, hurled the bundle over the edge of the canyon. There was a silence. Then a high-pitched, heart-wrenching yelp echoed against the ancient stone. It was the sound of something innocent meeting the world's cruelty. Elliot's body reacted before his mind did. He stumbled forward shouting, "Hey!" But the boys had already sprinted off, their laughter fading like smoke. He reached the edge, heart pounding, eyes scanning the rock face. Then, movement. A small shape, caught miraculously on a narrow outcropping of rock about 20 feet down. It was alive. Elliot exhaled, dropped to his knees, and began the descent without hesitation. There was a narrow path, rarely used, curling dangerously along the wall like a forgotten ribbon. His boots slid on loose gravel, and his knees screamed in protest as he crouched low to maintain balance. When he reached the ledge, he saw it properly for the first time, a German shepherd puppy, no more than a month old. The pup was thin, frighteningly so, with a dull tan coat streaked in patches of dirt and dried blood. One of its hind legs was swollen, twisted unnaturally. But what made Elliot's breath catch was the way it looked at him, not with fear, not even with pain, but with something ancient, like it had already given up. Its legs were bound together with a length of electrical wire, tight enough to cut skin. Elliot murmured softly, instinctively, "Hey there, it's okay," and removed his scarf, gently wrapping the puppy and cradling it to his chest. It whimpered once. That was all. The climb back up was harder. Elliot scraped his elbow, nearly lost his grip once, but refused to let go of the tiny creature now nestled against him. When he finally reached level ground, he collapsed onto his back, eyes to the sky, breath coming in harsh waves. The puppy trembled in his jacket, but it was breathing. It was alive. Back in Flagstaff, Elliot cleaned the puppy as best he could. He used warm water, a towel, and the old ceramic basin in his kitchen. His hands shook. The pup didn't resist. When he cut the wire off its legs, it flinched but didn't cry. Elliot laid it down gently on a folded blanket in a cardboard box by the heater. Then he sat down with his phone. For years, he had avoided social media, finding it chaotic and insincere. But something in him snapped, or perhaps finally reconnected. He took a photo. The puppy, curled up, still dirty, but unmistakably a baby, fragile, helpless, beautiful, and below it, the bloodied wire. He opened Facebook for the first time in months, wrote the caption simply, fingers moving with quiet fury. They threw him off a cliff like garbage, but he lived, and he's mine now. He hit post. Then he sat in silence, one hand resting gently on the box, the other clutching a cup of coffee gone cold, as the likes, comments, and shares began to climb. The morning after the rescue, the puppy still hadn't barked. It barely moved, curled like a question mark in the box near Elliot's heater. Its eyes opened now and then, glinting amber in the light, but it made no sound, no attempt to explore. Elliot watched from his writing desk, hands poised above a blank page he had no intention of filling. Instead, his gaze drifted again and again to the cardboard box. He didn't know yet why he felt bound to the little creature, only that something ancient had stirred inside him the moment their eyes met. He named it Rune. The word came unbidden, like the whisper of an old language. He remembered reading it once in a book of Norse symbols. Runes were messages etched in stone, tokens of fate. That was what the dog was to him, a message carved by circumstance and thrown from the heavens. That same afternoon, Elliot posted another photo. Rune wrapped in a faded towel, his head poking out like a sleepy fox. The caption read, "He still doesn't make a sound. But those eyes, they remember everything." The post went unnoticed for about an hour. Then something strange happened. A large Facebook page called Hearts for Paws reshared it. Then, Hope for the Voiceless. Then a TikTok user turned it into a short video set to a haunting piano melody. Within hours, the post had been viewed over 100,000 times. By nightfall, Elliot's phone was vibrating with notifications. People from all over sending love, prayers, offers to donate. Some sent angry messages demanding justice. The hashtag #JusticeForRune began to trend regionally. Elliot stared at it all in disbelief. He hadn't meant to start a movement. He only meant to bear witness. Late that evening, there was a knock at the door. Standing there in a gray blazer too large for her shoulders was a woman in her late 20s, Vietnamese American, with round, steady eyes behind thin wire-frame glasses and a sharp sense of purpose that clung to her like a second skin. Her black hair was cut in a chin-length bob that framed her narrow face like a brushstroke. "I'm Olivia Tran," she said quickly. "Reporter. I live down the street, actually. I used to read your books in high school." Elliot blinked, disoriented. "You read?" "The one about the grieving widower who talks to birds. Made me cry for a week." He allowed himself a ghost of a smile. "Ah, that one." She held up her phone. "I saw your post. And then the photos. And the name. Rune. I think there's a real story here." Elliot hesitated. He wasn't ready to share Rune with the world. But something in Olivia's tone, firm but reverent, made him open the door wider. Inside, Rune stirred. Olivia knelt slowly beside the box. She didn't reach out. She didn't coo or offer treats. She simply looked. After a moment, Rune lifted his head and blinked at her. "Do you know what's been done to him?" she asked softly. "Enough," Elliot said. She nodded. "And the ones who did it? I didn't see their faces. They wore masks." "But someone must know something," Olivia said, standing. "You said it happened near South Rim?" "Yes." She pulled a small notepad from her coat pocket. "That area has cameras, wildlife monitoring, and drone patrols. If the park rangers will cooperate, we might be able to match the time you were there with some footage." "Why would they cooperate?" Elliot asked, already cynical. She shrugged. "Because people care when stories go viral. Because this story, this dog, is going to mean something." The next morning, Olivia returned with her camera equipment. She interviewed Elliot on his porch, asking about the moment he saw the boys, the descent, the climb. She kept her questions respectful, never pushing too hard. Then she filmed Rune sleeping, the rise and fall of his little chest rhythmic, almost meditative. Elliot watched as Olivia worked, methodical, controlled, eyes scanning for meaning in every frame. She was the kind of woman who didn't waste words. He noticed the way she kept her voice even when Rune flinched at sudden sounds. He noticed, too, the way her hands trembled slightly when no one was watching. "Why animal stories?" he asked her when they took a break. She looked down. "I covered crime scenes for years, people hurting people, got numb. Then one day I did a piece on a shelter that saved a three-legged cat. The feedback, it wasn't just emotional, it was hopeful." She paused. "We let ourselves grieve more freely for animals. Maybe because they don't pretend." That night, she published her article, Thrown into Silence, the story of a puppy named Rune. Within hours, it was shared over 30,000 times. Elliot found himself pulled into something he couldn't quite name. People were emailing him. Not just well-wishers, former soldiers, therapists, survivors of abuse. One man wrote, "I know that silence. I lived it for years. Thank you for saving him. He saved me, too." One message struck him deeply. It came from a woman named Delilah Brooks, a middle school teacher in Sedona. Her note was short. "My students are following Rune's story like a pilgrimage. They made him cards. Where can we send them?" Elliot printed the email and placed it by Rune's box. The dog was healing slowly. The swelling in his leg had gone down. He had started shifting in his sleep, making faint whining noises when he dreamed. But he still hadn't barked. On the third day, Olivia returned with news. The Rangers had agreed to release security footage from the South Rim. The footage was grainy, taken from a distant drone, but it clearly showed two teenagers, one in a black hoodie with a red flame design, the other wearing a wolf mask, leaning over the edge and throwing something small. Olivia's hands trembled as she replayed it. "We can find them now," she said. "It's just a matter of time." Elliot wasn't sure how to feel. Vengeance had never sat well with him. But justice, that was different. Justice had structure. Justice meant no one else had to fall. By the end of the week, Olivia's article had been picked up by several larger outlets. She invited Elliot to speak in a local radio interview, which he reluctantly agreed to. His voice, rarely used outside of grocery store courtesies and book festival quandas, cracked slightly on the air. "I didn't mean to become a symbol," he said. "I just couldn't let something so small disappear." Rune, still wordless, lay curled beside him during the call. When the interview ended, Olivia posted a final update to her article. The man who used to write about broken people now holds something broken in his arms, and somehow, it's making both of them whole again. #justice for Rune surged. Volunteers began contacting shelters and police tip lines. Elliot's inbox overflowed with stories of abandoned pets, of cruel teenagers, of survivors. It was as though the whole world had remembered that cruelty could be fought back with compassion, and that sometimes one act of decency could ripple louder than any scream. But Rune had still not made a sound. Not yet. It was a gray Tuesday when Elliot carried Rune into the veterinary clinic, bundled in the same scarf he had used to rescue him. The dog was heavier now. Not much, just enough to notice. A bit more solid, a bit more real. Rune still didn't bark, still didn't wag his tail. But he watched the world with eyes far too old for a 1-month-old puppy. The clinic was small, tucked between a laundromat and a thrift store on the edge of Flagstaff. Its sign was faded, its windows smudged, but inside, the warmth was immediate. A golden retriever napped behind the receptionist's desk, and the faint scent of antiseptic mixed with something sweeter, perhaps lavender. Dr. Mason entered the exam room 5 minutes later. She was in her early 60s with short silver hair and hands that moved with deliberate grace. Tall and broad-shouldered, she wore a forest green coat over scrubs and had a necklace of tiny carved animals dangling from her neck. "Let's have a look at our little mystery," she said gently, offering her hand for Rune to sniff. Rune didn't move. He simply stared, motionless, head low. Elliot looked down. "He hasn't made a sound. Not once." Dr. Mason crouched, her face softening. "Sometimes silence is a survival instinct. Let's see what his body remembers." The examination took 20 minutes. X-rays, palpation, a blood test. Rune trembled through it all but didn't bite or whimper. When Dr. Mason returned with the results, her expression was grim. "There's old trauma," she said. "Multiple ribs healed incorrectly. Looks like he was kicked more than once. His rear leg shows signs of a hairline fracture that's trying to mend. And there are pressure sores on his belly and haunches. He was kept somewhere tight, for days, maybe weeks." Elliot's throat tightened. He nodded, unable to speak. Dr. Mason glanced up at him. "But his heart's strong. No internal bleeding. If you keep him warm, fed, and loved, he'll grow. He might limp, he might never bark, but he'll live." Elliot whispered, "That's more than I expected." On the drive home, Rune sat in Elliot's lap, wrapped in the scarf like a swaddled child. The road twisted along pine groves and hills, but Elliot drove slowly, one hand resting on Rune's back. The dog didn't sleep. He simply watched the trees pass by through the windshield, his head occasionally twitching, as if responding to sounds no one else could hear. That night, Elliot did something he hadn't done in years. He read aloud. He pulled an old volume of Leaves of Grass from the shelf, one of the only books he still kept on his nightstand, and sat on the couch beside Rune's box. His voice was rough at first, unused to being heard, but it steadied as he read. "I do not ask the wounded person how he feels. I myself become the wounded person." Rune didn't move, but his ears lifted slightly. He turned his head toward the sound. When Elliot stopped, Rune looked up. For the first time, there was something like longing in his expression. Elliot kept reading. Every night after that, it became their ritual. Whitman, Dickinson, Baldwin, Neruda, sometimes fiction, sometimes poetry, sometimes just fragments Elliot scribbled himself, barely formed. Rune never barked, but when Elliot stopped reading, Rune would nudge his leg as if urging him on. Meanwhile, Olivia had not slowed her investigation. She came by once a day, laptop in hand, scarf flapping in the wind, cheeks flushed from biking across town. She brought updates, screenshots, theories. She was tireless. The kind of woman who drank lukewarm coffee with no sugar and wrote notes in margins that trailed off into stars. Then, one evening, she brought something different. "I think I found them," she said, pushing her laptop toward Elliot. It was a TikTok account, username at pain=obedience. The videos were blurry and fast, filled with quick cuts, distorted audio, and darkness. Most showed shadowed figures wearing masks, goading dogs in cages with loud metal sounds and flashing lights. But in one clip, only a second long, you could see Rune. Elliot knew instantly. The small frame, the band of tan fur across the muzzle, the trembling shoulders. Rune was tied, backed into a corner, while someone outside the frame screamed through a speaker at full volume. Elliot recoiled, a visceral chill running through him. "Can we trace it?" he asked. Olivia nodded. "Not directly, but the background? Look." She zoomed into a wall, spray-painted symbols, crude drawings, and behind it, a sign that read, Marlowe Storage Unit 12, BA. It's a self-storage unit in Page, rented under a fake name, but I've got someone checking security cam footage. Elliot looked at her with something close to awe. "How do you know how to do all this?" She shrugged. "Used to cover protest movements, learned to find ghosts online." That night, Elliot couldn't sleep. The image of Rune backed into the corner haunted him. He needed to do something, to speak. So he recorded a video. No music, no edits, just him sitting on his porch, Rune in his lap. "This is Rune," he said, "a 1-month-old puppy who was tied, tortured, and thrown into a canyon. He hasn't barked since, but he listens. He listens when I read. He listens when the world is quiet. I don't know who hurt him, but we're going to find out. Not with anger, not with hate, but with truth." He ended the video with Rune lifting his nose, touching Elliot's hand gently. By morning, the video had over 3 million views. People began sending art, sketches of Rune, portraits of Elliot reading. Teachers emailed to say their students were holding Rune read alouds. Bookstores asked for signed copies of Elliot's out-of-print novels. The silence of Rune had become a chorus. Somewhere deep inside, Elliot began to write again. Not to sell, not to publish, just to tell the truth, his truth, Rune's truth, the kind of truth that needed no voice, only eyes that remembered everything. It was a late Thursday afternoon, and the light in Elliot's kitchen stretched long and gold across the tiled floor. Rune lay curled on a folded quilt beside the back door, his nose twitching in sleep. Outside, the trees rustled gently in the breeze. Elliot had begun to appreciate the small, quiet things again. Freshly brewed coffee, the scratch of pen on paper, Rune twitching in his dreams. But the peace didn't last. Olivia's knock came fast and sharp. She pushed open the door before Elliot could answer, her face flushed from biking, strands of hair clinging to her forehead. "I need your ears," she said, breathless. "Something's come up." Elliot followed her into the living room, where she set her laptop on the table and turned it toward him. A text conversation was open, anonymous, no profile picture, just a single name, Mira. "It started last night," Olivia explained. "She messaged me after watching Rune's video. She says she knows the boys who hurt him." Elliot leaned in. "How?" "She lived with them, or near enough. Her mom was the housekeeper for one of the families. She's only 13. They called her the Shadow." The screen filled with Mira's words, nervous, typed quickly. "They did things, not just to Rune, to other animals. I have a recording. Please don't tell them. Please." Olivia pressed play on a file she had already downloaded. The audio crackled, muffled at first, then clearer. Laughter. Teenage boys mocking, daring each other, a dog whimpering, a loud metallic crash followed by someone yelling, "Make it cower! If it pisses itself, we win!" Elliot closed his eyes. "She says this was Rune's first training session," Olivia whispered. "They were filming these videos as part of some stupid challenge series. They called it the Obedience Game." Elliot stood, crossing the room to Rune, who was now awake and watching them with cautious eyes. He knelt and laid a hand on the pup's back. Rune didn't flinch. He never did with Elliot anymore. But he didn't lean in either. That part was still healing. Olivia took a breath. The hate. They didn't invent it. It started with one of the boys' dads. Apparently, years ago, he was arrested during a robbery. A police dog bit him, tore his leg up pretty badly. He got off with a light sentence, but ever since he's been vocal about it. Elliot looked up, and the son inherited that anger. Turned it into a game, she said bitterly, and Rune was born into the wrong litter. They sat in silence, the weight of the truth filling the room like smoke. Olivia closed the laptop. Mira doesn't want to be identified. She's scared. Lives with her aunt now. Tiny apartment outside of Winslow. But she wants to help. She recorded everything in secret. Elliot stood. We need to do something with this, now. I already contacted the State Animal Welfare Board, Olivia said. Sent them everything anonymously. They've opened a file, but it'll take time. Rune doesn't have time, Elliot said. He needs this to end. That evening, Elliot did something new. He recorded another video. Rune standing on the front porch, taking cautious steps. The sunset painted the sky in rose and fire behind him. Elliot's voice, off camera, was calm. Look at him, he said. He still walks slowly, still doesn't bark, but he's here. He's healing. And no, he's not just a dog. He's a reminder that no creature should have to earn their right to live. He paused. Rune stopped at the edge of the porch, then turned toward the camera. There are people out there who call it a game, Elliot continued, but Rune is not a prize. He is not a joke. He is proof that cruelty can be survived, and we owe it to him to make sure no one else falls the way he did. He ended the video with a long shot of Rune staring into the horizon, as though listening for a sound that had not yet arrived. Within 24 hours, the video was shared over 2 million times. The internet erupted. Comments poured in. A teacher from Oregon organized a Rune walk at her school. A local councilman in Nevada issued a public statement condemning youth cruelty and pushing for a new animal protection bill. A group of high school students from New Jersey created a digital mural of Rune, built from thousands of user-submitted images of rescued pets. And through it all, Mira continued messaging Olivia. She described one of the boys, Jason Morrow, 16, tall, athletic, blonde, a lacrosse player, lived in a gated community near Phoenix. Mira remembered him always trying to prove something, always laughing the loudest when things got cruel. His father, Edward Morrow, was a real estate mogul with a chip on his shoulder and a long-standing grudge against the police. The second boy was harder to track. Mira only knew him as T, but said he wore black all the time and filmed everything with a handheld camcorder from the early 2000s, calling it Vintage Fear. With these new names, Olivia reached out to a contact in the Phoenix Chronicle, a crime reporter named Marcus Dean. He was in his late 40s, wore rumpled suits, and always had a toothpick between his teeth. Gruff, skeptical, but loyal to stories that mattered. Marcus met them at a diner just off the interstate. He listened to everything, flipping through Olivia's folder of evidence with furrowed brows. When they played him the audio clip, he shook his head slowly. "Disgusting little bastards," he muttered. He leaned back, chewing thoughtfully on his toothpick. "I'll make a few calls. You won't hear from me till there's something real. But I believe the girl. You don't fake that kind of fear." Elliot watched Olivia the whole time, her posture straight, her voice steady, but her knuckles white where they gripped her coffee mug. He realized then that she wasn't just chasing this story. She was carrying it. That night, Elliot sat on his porch, Rune at his feet, and pulled out a notebook. He wrote, "What we do to the silent shapes us, not in how they break, but in how we learn to listen." Rune shifted, placing his head on Elliot's foot. Inside, Elliot's phone vibrated again. The video was now trending on the front page of Reddit. People were tagging local officials, demanding action. The hashtag #JusticeForRune had hit national news. But Rune still had not barked, and Mira's voice, thin and afraid, still played in Elliot's mind. "Please, don't let them know it was me." By the end of the week, Rune was no longer just a story. He was a movement. His eyes, solemn and watchful, had become the symbol of a reckoning. It was Elliot's photo, Rune standing in a patch of golden morning light, his head tilted, the faint scars still visible on his legs, that landed on the front page of the Arizona Sun under the headline, "The Dog That Changed Everything." Elliot hadn't known the journalist, hadn't expected the call. Her name was Daniela Rivas, A woman in her mid-30s with tightly curled hair pulled back into a low bun, eyes the color of steel, and a voice both calm and commanding. She had grown up in South Phoenix, where strays outnumbered people in some blocks, and had made it her mission to cover stories of resilience, human and otherwise. She visited Elliot's house with a single camera and a leather notebook full of folded pages. Rune sniffed her boots cautiously, but didn't retreat. "I've seen worse," Daniela murmured as Rune rested beside Elliot's chair, half asleep but alert. "But I haven't seen better than this," she added, motioning to the way Rune leaned against Elliot's foot. The article she wrote was spare, unsentimental, and devastating. It charted Rune's journey not as a tragedy, but as a testament. It asked questions the town didn't want to hear. How did we miss this? What silence are we complicit in? Within 48 hours, the story was picked up by CNN, featured in their Sunday night segment, Kindness in Crisis. Elliot watched the clip on Olivia's phone as they sat on his porch, the sun dipping low behind the pines. The anchor's voice was polished and cool, but the footage of Rune limping across the porch, of Elliot reading poetry to him, of Olivia typing beside a stack of evidence, was raw. When the segment ended, Olivia said nothing, only reached down to rub Rune behind his ear. The ripples kept spreading. ASPCA dispatched a formal investigation team to Flagstaff. 2 agents arrived in clean-fitted Navy uniforms, carrying briefcases and quiet, stern energy. The lead agent, Veronica Shaw, was in her early 40s, athletic, with a face that had long since learned not to flinch. She had worked in New Orleans post-Katrina, had seen puppies drown in locked cages, and never forgot a single one. She reviewed Olivia's files in silence, nodding occasionally, but it was Mira's audio, the broken laughter, the whimpering dog, the crashing sounds, that made her lips tighten. "This isn't just cruelty," she said flatly. "This is systemic." The mayor of Flagstaff, a balding man named Henry Lowe with small eyes and a polished voice, called a press conference 2 days later. His tone was solemn but measured, his suit pressed without a crease. "We are horrified by the abuse suffered by the dog known as Rune," he said, before a crowd of cameras and murmuring journalists. "The city of Flagstaff will no longer turn away from cases like this. We are working with ASPCA and law enforcement to ensure these individuals are brought to justice." It was something. A spark, at least. But it wasn't until Elliot stood in front of a room full of teenagers that the fire truly caught. It was Olivia's idea. She had been contacted by a teacher from the local high school, Mrs. Leona Garcia, a thin woman with streaks of silver in her thick black hair and an intensity that commanded silence without ever raising her voice. Her students had shared Rune's memes, mocked his name before understanding his story. She wanted Elliot to speak. Not to punish, but to open their eyes. Elliot hadn't stood in front of a classroom in over a decade. His palms sweat as he stepped into the bright, echoey auditorium. Rune stayed backstage with Olivia, resting on a donated dog bed and clutching a small plush fox in his paws. The students were restless, phones out, sneakers tapping, whispers. But when Elliot stepped up to the podium and cleared his throat, a hush fell. "I'm not here to preach," he began, his voice steady but worn. "I'm not a teacher. I'm just a man who once watched something small and terrified get thrown from a cliff, and couldn't pretend it didn't matter." He paused, scanning their faces. Some looked away, others met his eyes, unsure. "Silence doesn't make you innocent," he said. "It makes the hurt last longer. Rune is silent because someone taught him fear. Some of you laughed at his pain. Some of you didn't. But you saw it. You clicked. You shared." There was a shift. A boy in the front row put his phone away. A girl crossed her arms but lowered her head. "I'm not asking for shame," Elliot said. "I'm asking for change." When he stepped off stage, the room was silent. Then, quietly, someone clapped. And another. By the time he reached Olivia, the whole room was on its feet. Later that afternoon, Olivia brought Rune a gift. A small rubber toy shaped like a hedgehog with a bell inside. Rune eyed it suspiciously, pawed it once, then again. When it made a soft ringing sound, he froze. Then, he barked. It wasn't loud. It was scratchy, uncertain. But it was a bark, his first. Elliot dropped to his knees in astonishment. Rune barked again, tail thumping against the floor once, then twice. Olivia laughed, tears rising behind her glasses. "You did it, buddy," she whispered. That evening they posted a short video of the moment. Rune barking at the toy, Elliot gasping, Olivia laughing. No music, no narration, just truth. The clip reached 4 million views in a day. The final ripple came when Mira stepped forward. It was her decision. Olivia never pressured. But the girl appeared at the door one evening with her aunt, a tired woman in her 50s named Corinne, who wore a faded denim jacket and carried the weight of someone who'd been working 3 jobs since she was 20. Mira wore a red hoodie, too large for her small frame. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun. Freckles dotted her nose. She kept her hands clenched inside the sleeves. "I want to say something," she said, her voice shaking. They filmed the interview in Elliot's living room. Olivia held the camera. Elliot and Rune sat quietly behind the girl. "I lived with them," Mira said. "I saw what they did. I didn't stop it. I didn't know how." She looked down, then up again. Her eyes were filled with guilt, but also something stronger. "I'm sorry, Rune," she said. "I'm sorry I was part of the silence." Rune tilted his head, ears perked. And when Mira began to cry, it was Olivia, not her aunt, who stepped forward and wrapped her in a hug. That image, Olivia holding Mira, Rune sitting beside them, was shared around the world. The girl in the red hoodie, the dog that didn't die, the woman who helped them speak. And somewhere deep inside the silence, the flame burned brighter. The courthouse in downtown Flagstaff stood like a tired monument, its sandstone walls darkened by decades of desert wind. It was small compared to the grand city halls of Phoenix or Tucson, but it had an air of finality to it. Like truths were forced to sit still here, no longer allowed to hide behind whispers or laughter. That morning, a low winter sun spilled across the concrete steps, painting everything gold except the eyes of the 2 boys being led through the doors. Jason Morrow, 16, tall, broad-shouldered, with tousled blonde hair that refused to stay in place, wore a tailored navy blazer and a mask of practiced contrition. His father, Edward Morrow, followed closely, a powerfully built man in his 50s, silver hair slicked back, eyes hollow but sharp. He walked like someone who was not used to being summoned, only obeyed. Beside Jason was Ty T. Radley, also 16, slighter in build, wearing all black with his camera bag slung across his chest like armor. His face was pale, his lips a thin line of denial. His mother, a woman named Caroline Radley, short, stiff, tightly wound into a charcoal suit, gripped his wrist like it was a leash. Inside the courtroom, there were no press cameras, no sweeping shots, but there was weight in the air, the kind that pressed into people's bones. Elliot sat quietly at the back, Rune beside his feet, calm but alert. The dog had gained weight, his fur had filled in. His eyes were still somber, but they no longer wandered. They were fixed, steady, present. Olivia sat beside Elliot, a yellow notepad on her lap, though she hadn't written a word since they arrived. Mira, in her red hoodie, sat 1 row behind them, her aunt's hand wrapped around hers like a rope across a bridge. The judge was a tall man in his late 50s named Howard Klein, broad frame, trimmed beard, a sharpness behind his reading glasses that made you believe he remembered every word. He had once prosecuted animal abuse cases himself, back when the law still called it property damage. The evidence was laid bare. TikTok videos, Mira's recordings, witness testimony, footage from the Grand Canyon drone camera showing 2 figures tossing a wriggling object over the ledge. There was no debate anymore about what had happened. The question now was what it meant. The boys' lawyers tried everything. Jason's attorney, a man in a sleek gray suit with hair dyed a little too dark, spoke of youthful ignorance, a moment of peer pressure, the potential of a bright future derailed. Ty's lawyer leaned into artistic interpretation, calling the videos experimental commentary on discipline and control. Judge Klein stared through all of it, like someone watching shadows dance on the wall of a cave, waiting for real shape to emerge. Then Mira stood. She was small compared to the podium. Her voice shook on the first sentence, but gained strength like flame feeding on air. She spoke not just of what she saw, but of what she didn't stop. Of the nights she couldn't sleep because she had closed her eyes while someone else suffered. Of Rune's eyes. How they never left her, even when she walked away. When she was done, There wasn't a sound in the courtroom. No coughing, no shifting chairs, just silence. The kind that feels like a held breath before the verdict. In the end, Judge Klein ruled what many had hoped, but few had expected. Jason and Ty were both to be tried as juveniles, but would face the maximum sentence allowable under state law: mandatory community service at licensed animal shelters, extensive psychological evaluations, probationary oversight for 2 years, and full enrollment in a rehabilitative education program on empathy and violence prevention. They were forbidden to own or be near pets for 5 years. It wasn't prison, but it wasn't nothing. After the ruling, Elliot was asked if he wished to make a statement regarding damages or restitution. He stood, adjusted his old brown jacket, and walked slowly to the front of the room. "I don't want money," he said. "I want change." He looked at Jason, who stared at the floor, then at Ty, whose camera bag had been confiscated hours earlier. "Rune was thrown away," Elliot said, "but he didn't break. He still walks beside me every day. I don't want this to end with guilt. I want it to start with purpose." He paused, then added, "I'm asking the community to help me launch something new, a foundation, a fund, for every Rune that's still waiting in a cage, unheard and unseen." He stepped down to murmurs of support. Olivia reached over and squeezed his hand. The idea caught fire almost immediately. Within 24 hours, the Rune Foundation had a GoFundMe page. Donations poured in. Some from animal lovers, some from people who had once felt voiceless themselves. Others came from places Elliot would never have imagined: an elementary school in Maine, a motorcycle club in Utah, a retired K-9 officer in Illinois who had lost his partner to a drunk driver. The fund grew. So did the hope. Olivia published her piece that same night. It was titled "The Dog and the Storyteller." It didn't rehash every detail or reprint every tearful quote. Instead, it followed the arc of a quiet man, a broken dog, and the silence between them that became something else, something holy. The article didn't scream, it whispered, and somehow that was louder than anything else. By morning, it had been shared over 70,000 times. Elliot read the final paragraph aloud to Rune in the living room, the dog curled against his leg like always. "We spend so much of life learning how to speak, but sometimes the most powerful stories are told in the stillness. A man with no answers, a dog with no voice, and the fragile miracle that happens when one listens to the other." He paused. Rune stirred, shifting his head to rest on Elliot's foot. Then Elliot did something he hadn't done in years. He opened his laptop and stared at the blank document with a sense of calm. Not the panic that usually came with a deadline, but the steady quiet of readiness. The title came first. It always did. Fall without breaking. He began to write. Not to escape, not to prove anything, but to remember. The story wasn't just Rune's anymore. It was Mira's, Olivia's, his own. It was everyone who had ever fallen and been caught. And as the keys tapped softly in the stillness, Rune lifted his head, looked up at the man beside him, and wagged his tail once. The wind at the edge of the Grand Canyon whispered like it remembered. A year had passed since Elliot March last stood here, and still the cliffs hummed with that ancient silence he had once mistaken for emptiness. But now he knew better. Now he understood that silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the breath held before a song, the pause before healing began. Rune stood tall beside him, no longer the trembling bundle of fur wrapped in a scarf, but a full-grown German shepherd with a thick, healthy coat the color of golden dusk. His gait had a slight hitch from the healed fracture, but it didn't slow him down. There was pride in the way he moved now, a calm confidence in how he sniffed the air and scanned the horizon, as if guarding the memories that had shaped him. His eyes, once dulled by fear, now gleamed with sharp intelligence and something gentler: trust. Olivia Tran climbed to the final stretch of trail a few paces behind them. She wore a maroon windbreaker, her dark hair pulled into a practical braid, hiking boots dusty with Red Canyon soil. She moved with the ease of someone who had made peace with her own weight, emotional and otherwise. She'd spent the last year documenting not just Rune's journey, but others like his. Her stories had shifted public policies, inspired rescue networks, even launched programs in schools. But she never claimed credit. She always said it started with Rune. Elliot turned and offered her his hand, steadying her as she reached the summit. Their fingers lingered longer than needed, but neither pulled away. "You still sure about this?" she asked, nodding toward the laptop tucked under Elliot's arm. "Too late to back out now," he smiled, lines deepening at the corners of his eyes. He looked different than he had a year ago, less brittle, less faded. His beard had filled in more, silver streaked with cinnamon, and he wore his usual brown canvas jacket over a gray shirt that clung to his still slender frame. But something had returned to him, something lost in the ashes of divorce, of silence, of guilt. He had become a storyteller again. They reached the overlook, flat rock like a stage above a sea of shadow and fire. The sun was descending, casting molten light over the ridges. Elliot set up the camera on a small tripod, angled to catch the view behind him. Olivia checked the stream settings, adjusted the focus, then gave a quick thumbs up. Going live in 5, 4. Elliot sat cross-legged, the laptop open on his knees. Rune circled once, then lay down beside him, placing his head on Elliot's lap. Olivia settled beside them, just off camera, but close enough for her warmth to reach him. Thousands joined the stream within seconds, then tens of thousands. By the time Elliot began reading, the number climbed past 1 million. His voice was quiet at first, unrushed, as though speaking directly to one person. "This is the final chapter," he said, "of a book I never intended to write. It's called Fall Without Breaking, and this is how it ends." He began reading, the words flowing not as performance, but as memory. When the world became too loud, he curled into himself and forgot how to speak. They said he was broken, but what they didn't know was that silence is not absence, it is survival. And in the stillness, he listened, to pages turning, to wind through canyon stone, to footsteps that didn't hurt. And he began slowly to rise. Olivia watched him as he read. She had read every draft of the manuscript, every revision. But this, the cadence of Elliot's voice mingling with the hush of the canyon and the soft breath of Rune at his side, this was something else. It was a reckoning, a requiem, a benediction. Elliot's voice lowered, reverent. When the abyss calls, it does not always ask for your body. Sometimes it only wants your hope. And when it throws you, screaming, into its teeth, there are no gods to catch you. But sometimes there is a man, or a girl, or a dog with no bark but 1,000 truths in his eyes, and they reach, and they catch you, and that too is a miracle. He closed the laptop slowly. Silence wrapped around them, not heavy, but full. Rune stirred, lifted his head, and looked out over the canyon. Then, suddenly, he barked, sharp, clear, and proud. It echoed across the rocks like a hymn. Elliot chuckled, wiping at his eyes. "He approves," Olivia whispered. Rune stood, tail wagging slowly, then turned in a circle and sat again, eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind him, the sun kissed the last ridge before slipping into shadow. Across the screen, comments poured in. "I'm crying. That dog saved me. We need more Ellies and more Runes. Watching from Tokyo, from a shelter in Ukraine, still hoping." Elliot glanced at Olivia. "You think they'll remember?" She smiled, eyes glistening. "They already do." Rune shifted again, resting his head against Elliot's leg. Olivia reached over, fingers brushing Elliot's. This time, neither looked away. The live stream lingered as the light faded, Rune still and watchful as ever. By the time Elliot finally closed the stream, the number had surpassed 3 million viewers. And in that final frame, man, dog, canyon, dusk, a new kind of silence bloomed. Not the silence of being forgotten, but the kind that meant something had been heard. Sometimes, miracles don't come with thunder or light. Sometimes, they arrive in silence, wrapped in fur, in pain, in a pair of eyes that refuse to give up. Rune was thrown into darkness, but grace found him not in the hands of angels, but in the arms of a quiet man who chose to care. And maybe that's how God moves. Through people like Elliot, through girls like Mira, through you and me, in the moments when we choose kindness over comfort, action over silence. If this story touched your heart, share it. Leave a comment below. Tell us if you've ever witnessed something you knew you couldn't ignore. And if you believe that even the smallest life is worth saving, hit the like button, subscribe, and help us spread this light. May God bless every soul who's still healing and every hand that dares to reach out when the world turns away. And may Rune's journey remind us all that even from the deepest fall, love can rise. A biker slammed his boot into a